I woke up to the sound of muffled sobs, the kind that aren't loud but fill the room with an unmistakable weight. It was dark, well past midnight, and the house was silent except for the faint, rhythmic hiccups coming from the kitchen. My first thought was fear, that something terrible had happened. Maybe she had a bad dream. Maybe she was sick. I got out of bed and walked quietly down the hall, my bare feet sticking to the cold floor. The kitchen light was on, spilling a pale glow into the otherwise dark house. There she was, my wife, sitting at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook as she tried to stifle her crying, but it only seemed to make it worse. I hesitated, my heart racing. I didn't want to startle her, but seeing her like that, so fragile, it made something twist inside me. This wasn't like her. She was always so composed, sometimes maddeningly so. The woman who would argue about toothpaste brands like it was a court case didn't break easily. And here she was breaking. "Hey," I said softly, stepping into the light. She froze, like a deer caught in headlights, and for a split second, I saw the flash of panic in her red, swollen eyes. Then she looked away, hastily wiping her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she muttered, her voice thick with tears. But the way she avoided my gaze told me otherwise. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Talk to me." Her hands trembled as she clutched her coffee mug. It was cold, untouched. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared into the distance like she was trying to figure out how to form the words. Finally, she whispered, I've done something I can't take back." The air in the room seemed to shift. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to expect, but it was like my body already knew it was bad. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She swallowed hard, tears streaming down her face again. "I've been unfaithful." The words hit like a brick to the chest. I blinked, trying to process what I'd just heard. It didn't make sense. This was my wife, the woman I'd loved for a decade, the woman who knew my flaws and my fears, who could make me laugh so hard I cried. How? Was all I could manage. She finally looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected, self-loathing. "It's not because I don't love you," she said quickly, like she needed to get the words out before I could hate her. "Ido. God. Ido. It's just, I stopped loving myself, and somewhere along the way, I got lost." Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know what to say. Anger and heartbreak bubbled inside me, but so did something else, confusion, a desperate need to understand. "Who?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It doesn't matter. It was a mistake, just once, but it's eating me alive, and I couldn't keep lying to you." I sat there, stunned, feeling the weight of everything she wasn't saying. This wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about something deeper, something broken in her that I hadn't seen, or worse, hadn't wanted to see. For the first time, I realized we were standing at a crossroads, and I wasn't sure which path to take. Would I walk away? Or would I stay and try to make sense of the shattered pieces she'd just placed between us? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at her. My mind was a swirling storm of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion. But beneath it all, there was an ache that felt almost physical, a hollowing out of something I didn't even know could be hollowed. "You're telling me this now," I said finally, my voice low, almost a whisper. "Why?" She flinched, like the words themselves had cut her. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore. With myself. With what I'd done to us. You deserve to know the truth. Did you think knowing would make it better?" My tone came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I was hurt, raw, and the sight of her sitting there, crying, didn't soften it. "I thought," she stopped, shaking her head. "I don't know what I thought. I just knew I couldn't keep this from you any longer." I leaned back in my chair, trying to catch my breath, trying to think past the storm of fury and grief. "So what now? You drop this on me, and then what? You expect me to just what? Move past it?" "No," her voice cracked, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. "I don't expect anything. I don't know what else to do but tell you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I broke something I might never fix, but I couldn't keep lying to you. I had to tell you the truth." I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit there and drown in this moment. I paced the kitchen, the cold tile biting at my bare feet. "You had an affair," I said, mostly to myself, as if saying it aloud would help me make sense of it. You cheated on me, and now you want points for coming clean?" "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice rising slightly, but then she seemed to think better of it. She slumped forward, her hands running through her hair. "I'm not trying to justify it. I can't justify it. I lost myself, okay? Somewhere along the way, I stopped being me, and instead of dealing with that, I ran to someone who made me feel, I don't know, seen, alive. And it was wrong. I know that." Her words felt like acid, burning as they sank in. My fists clenched and unclenched at my sides, and for a moment, I thought about leaving, about walking out the door and letting her sit with her guilt and her tears. But something kept me rooted there. A morbid curiosity, maybe, or a glimmer of the love I wasn't ready to admit was still there, even in pieces. "When?" I asked finally. "When did this happen?" She hesitated, then whispered, 2 months ago. 2 months. For 2 months, she'd been sitting on this, sharing meals with me, smiling at me, sleeping beside me. "And what? You just decided tonight was the night to unburden yourself? Why now?" I demanded, my voice rising with every word. She looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears, and something in her expression stopped me cold. It was more than guilt. It was desperation. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing herself. "Because I'm falling apart," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been falling apart for a long time, and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to ask for help. And now, I've ruined the one thing that mattered." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream at her, to break something, to let the anger consume me. But beneath the anger was something else, something I hated even more: pity. She wasn't the strong, stubborn woman I'd married. She was a shell of herself, crumbling under the weight of her own mistakes. And as much as I wanted to turn away, to protect myself from the pain she'd caused, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still loved her, that wanted to understand. But could I forgive her? Could I ever look at her the same way again? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. I didn't sleep that night. After her confession, I left the kitchen and walked upstairs to the bedroom. Not because I wanted to sleep there, but because I needed space to think, to breathe. I could hear her downstairs, still crying softly, but I couldn't bring myself to go back down. The walls of the house felt thinner than ever, the air thick and suffocating. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to piece together how we had gotten here. 2 months. For 2 months, she'd carried this secret. How many lies had she told me in that time? How many times had she smiled at me, kissed me, held me, all while carrying the weight of this betrayal? I didn't even realize when the sun began to rise. The faint morning light filtered through the curtains, but it brought no clarity, only the dull ache of exhaustion. Eventually, I heard her footsteps on the stairs, hesitant and uneven, as if she were testing whether I'd explode if she came closer. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes swollen and red. She'd changed into sweatpants and an old hoodie, the armor of someone trying to disappear into themselves. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I wanted to tell her no, to tell her to leave me the hell alone. But instead I nodded. She perched on the edge of the chair across from me, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I know I've ruined everything," she began, "but I need you to know it wasn't about you. It was about me. I felt like I wasn't enough. Not for you, not for myself. I started doubting everything. My choices, my life, my worth. And instead of talking to you, I ran. I made the worst mistake of my life." Her words felt hollow, rehearsed. I stared at her, my jaw tight. "That doesn't make it better," I said, my voice cold. "You should have talked to me. You should have trusted me. But instead, you betrayed me." "I know," she sniffled, wiping at her face. "And I hate myself for it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you. Because even if it means you'll leave me, I couldn't keep lying. Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. This wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper, a raw, festering wound she'd been hiding for years. I could see it now, the cracks that had been forming beneath the surface of our life together. And I hated myself for not seeing them sooner. I don't know if I can do this, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can look at you and not see what you've done. Her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. I understand. Do you? I asked, my tone sharp. Because right now it feels like you're still trying to control the narrative. You're making this about you, about your pain, your guilt. What about me? What about what you've done to us? I know, she whispered. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. And if you decide to walk away, I'll accept that. But if there's even a small part of you that wants to try, I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll give you all the space you need. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. Her words hung in the air, a desperate plea, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could fix this. But how could I trust her again? How could I let myself be vulnerable with someone who had shattered me? I don't know, I said, my voice breaking. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll wait, she said quietly. I'll wait as long as it takes. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The weight of her words pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. Could I forgive her? Could I ever find a way to move forward? Or was this the beginning of the end? The day crawled by like an eternity. I avoided her as much as possible, and she did the same, retreating into the bedroom while I stayed in the living room. The house felt like a fragile thing. One wrong move, and it would shatter completely. I didn't know what to do with myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting at that table, crying, confessing. Every time I opened them, I was haunted by the silence she left behind. By the evening, I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I didn't want to talk, but there was no way to ignore what had happened. This was our marriage, our life, and as much as I wanted to run, I owed it to myself to face it. When I walked into the bedroom, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding herself together. She looked up when I entered, her eyes swollen from crying. We need to talk, I said, my voice flat. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Okay. I stayed by the door, leaning against the frame, putting as much distance between us as I could. Why did you think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't feel it? You've been distant for months. Do you know how many nights I lay awake, wondering what I'd done wrong? Wondering why you didn't look at me the way you used to? I didn't mean to hurt you, she said softly. I was in a dark place. I didn't even know how to talk to you about it. And when I did what I did, I hated myself so much that I couldn't bear to face you. Her words sparked something inside me, a mix of anger and despair. So instead of coming to me, instead of trusting me, you went to someone else? You let them have a piece of you that was supposed to be mine? Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. I know I broke everything, but I didn't stop loving you. I swear to God, I never stopped loving you. Don't. My voice was sharp, cutting through her sobs. Don't tell me you love me. Love doesn't look like this. She looked up at me then, her eyes red and filled with desperation. What do you want me to say? That I'm a terrible person? That I don't deserve you? Because I know that already. But if there's any part of you that still wants to fight for this, I'll fight too. I'll do whatever it takes. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold on to the life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared. But her betrayal had carved a hole so deep, I wasn't sure it could ever be filled. I don't know if I can do this, I said finally, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can forgive you, or if I even want to. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, it looked like she was going to collapse under the weight of my words. But then she straightened, wiping her tears. I understand, she said quietly, but I'm not giving up on us. Even if you hate me, even if you leave, I won't stop fighting for you. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You don't get to decide how this plays out. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about me. And right now I need time. I need space. Because I can't keep pretending that this didn't break me. She nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." I turned and walked out of the room, the weight of her words following me like a shadow. I didn't know what the future held, whether we could rebuild or if this was the end. All I knew was that the cracks in our marriage were too deep to ignore, and the only thing I could do now was figure out if they could ever be repaired. The days that followed felt like living in a haze. Every moment was heavy, weighed down by questions I couldn't answer. The house was eerily quiet, as though neither of us wanted to disturb the fragile truce we'd reached. She stayed in the bedroom most of the time, giving me the space I'd asked for. I threw myself into work, leaving early and coming home late, trying to avoid the suffocating reality waiting for me inside those walls. But no matter how much I tried to escape, the thoughts followed me everywhere. I'd replay every detail in my mind. The night she confessed, the look in her eyes when she admitted what she'd done, the sound of her voice breaking as she told me she still loved me. I wanted to hate her. God, I wanted it to be that simple. But it wasn't. Because as much as I hated what she'd done, I couldn't shut off the part of me that still loved her. One evening, about a week after her confession, I came home to find her sitting on the couch. It was the first time she'd been out of the bedroom since that night. She looked fragile, like she'd been holding herself together with sheer willpower. Her eyes followed me as I walked through the door, but she didn't say anything. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to acknowledge her or retreat upstairs. But something about the way she looked at me, so full of regret and longing, made me pause. How long are we going to keep living like this? I asked, breaking the silence. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. I don't know. I don't know what you need from me. I don't even know if there's anything I can do to fix this. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against it, crossing my arms. What do you think fixing this even looks like? Do you think it's just going to be me waking up one day and pretending like none of this happened? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I know it's not that simple. I know it'll take time, maybe a lifetime, but I'm willing to try, if you are. Her words should have been comforting, but instead, they just made me feel tired. You keep saying you'll do anything, but what does that even mean? You can't undo what you did. You can't erase it. I know, she whispered, but I can try to rebuild the trust one broke. I can show you every day that I'm still the person you fell in love with. Or at least, I can try to be her again. That's not enough, I said, the bitterness creeping into my voice. I don't even know who you are anymore. And honestly, I don't know if I want to. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry this time. She just nodded, as though she'd expected it. I'll give you whatever space you need, she said softly. But I'm not giving up on us. Not unless you tell me to. Her persistence was both infuriating and heartbreaking. I wanted to scream at her to leave, to let me be angry, to let me grieve what she'd destroyed. But at the same time, there was a part of me that clung to the idea of us, of the life we'd built, the love we'd shared before it all fell apart. I don't know what I want, I admitted, my voice cracking. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. But I can't make that decision right now. She nodded again, her expression unreadable. I understand. I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sitting alone in the silence. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the faintest flicker of something. Maybe hope, or maybe just a memory of what we used to have. I didn't know what the future held for us, whether we could rebuild, or if this was the beginning of the end. All I knew was that for now, we were both still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Time moved differently after her confession. Days dragged on, yet weeks passed in a blur. The distance between us became something tangible, a chasm carved out of hurt and mistrust. We lived in the same house, but it felt like we were on opposite sides of the world. She tried. I saw that. Small gestures. A cup of coffee left on the counter for me in the morning. Folded laundry on my side of the bed. Meals cooked with a silent, almost desperate diligence. But I couldn't accept any of it. Every kind act felt like a plaster on a bullet wound, and every reminder of her effort reopened the pain. I didn't know how to talk to her anymore. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many questions I wanted to ask, but every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I buried myself in work, in mindless tasks, in anything that would keep me from having to face the reality of what had happened. One night, about a month after everything came to light, she finally broke the silence. We were sitting at the dinner table, the sound of our utensils scraping against the plates the only thing breaking the quiet. She put down her fork and looked at me, her hands trembling slightly. "I can't keep pretending everything is okay," she said softly. I froze mid-bite, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "I never said everything was okay." "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't keep living like this, avoiding each other, avoiding the truth. It's killing me, and I think it's killing you too." Her words hit a nerve, but I didn't want to admit it. "What do you want me to say? That I'm fine? That I've forgiven you? Because I haven't. I don't expect you to," she said quickly, her eyes pleading. "But I need to know where we stand. Are we even trying to fix this? Or am I just holding on to something that's already gone?" I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. She seemed smaller somehow, like the guilt and regret had physically shrunk her. But there was still a flicker of determination in her eyes, a stubborn hope that hadn't yet been extinguished. "I don't know," I admitted, the words heavy on my tongue. "I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. And I don't know if I even want to try." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she was going to cry. But she didn't. She straightened her shoulders and nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Then tell me what you need," she said. "If you need me to leave, I'll go. If you need space, I'll give it to you. But if there's even a small part of you that wants to try, I need to know, because I can't keep living in limbo." Her words sliced through me, leaving me raw and exposed. I hated the limbo too, the uncertainty of not knowing whether we were moving forward or simply waiting for the inevitable end. But I didn't have an answer for her. "Not yet. I need time," I said finally, my voice cracking. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I also don't know if I can walk away." "Not yet." She nodded again, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. "I'll wait," she said softly, "for as long as it takes." As I sat there, staring at the woman who had broken my heart and yet still held a piece of it, I realized that the path ahead wasn't just uncertain, it was uncharted. I didn't know if we could rebuild what had been lost, or if we were just prolonging the inevitable. But for now, we were still here, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep trying. The days after our conversation felt heavier somehow. There was no pretending anymore, no careful sidestepping around the truth. We were both painfully aware of the fragility of what was left between us, and every interaction felt like walking on a tightrope over an abyss. She tried harder than ever. Every time she looked at me, I could see the weight of her guilt, the silent plea for a sign that I might still love her. And maybe that was the problem. I didn't know if I did, or if the love I felt for her could survive what she'd done. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us became unbearable. I turned off the TV and looked at her. She was curled up on the couch, staring at her hands, and I realized she hadn't looked me in the eye for days. "I can't do this," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Her head shot up, panic flashing across her face. "Do what?" "This half-life we're living," I said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "It's like we're waiting for something to change, but nothing's going to change unless we do something." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. "What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. But then the words came, heavy and uncertain. "We need to figure out if this is worth saving. If we're worth saving." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I want to try. I know I'm the one who broke us, but I want to fix it. I just don't know how." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Maybe we need help. A therapist. Someone who can help us make sense of this, because I sure as hell can't do it on my own." She wiped her tears and gave a small, shaky nod. "Okay, I'll do whatever it takes." The conversation felt like a step forward, but it also brought a new weight. Agreeing to therapy meant confronting everything head on, no more hiding, no more pretending, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. A week later, we had our first session. The therapist was a calm, soft-spoken woman who greeted us warmly and asked us to start by sharing why we were there. I froze, the words catching in my throat, but my wife spoke first. "I betrayed him," she said, her voice trembling. "I made the worst mistake of my life, and now I don't know if he'll ever be able to forgive me." The therapist nodded, her expression gentle. "And what about you?" she asked, turning to me. "How do you feel?" I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I feel angry, hurt, lost. I don't know if I can forgive her, but I also don't know if I can walk away. I feel stuck." The therapist nodded again. "That's a completely normal response. It's clear there's a lot of pain here, but also a desire to understand each other. That's a good place to start." The session was exhausting, like dragging old wounds into the light and watching them bleed again. But it also felt like the first real step towards something. Whether that was healing or closure, I didn't know yet. As we left the office, my wife reached for my hand, hesitating for a moment before lacing her fingers with mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on tightly either. It was a tentative gesture, fragile and uncertain, much like us. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that therapy wasn't going to give me the answers I craved. It wouldn't magically fix what was broken, but it might help us understand if there was anything left to save. Therapy was harder than I imagined. Each session felt like picking at a scab, exposing the raw wound underneath. But it also forced us to have conversations we'd been avoiding for years. Conversations that were painful but necessary. One session, about 3 weeks in, the therapist asked us to talk about the turning points in our relationship. The moments where things began to change for better or worse. I went first, recounting the early years of our marriage when everything felt easy, when we could talk for hours about nothing and still feel connected. I talked about how that connection had slowly eroded, replaced by routines and unspoken resentment. Then it was her turn. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I think it started when I stopped feeling seen," she said softly. "Not because of you. You've always been kind and loving. But I started looking at myself and seeing nothing. I didn't know who I was anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't you let me in?" She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I didn't want to burden you. You've always been the strong one, the steady one. I didn't know how to say that I was falling apart." The therapist intervened, her voice calm and steady. "This is an important moment. You're both acknowledging the gap that formed between you. It's not about placing blame. It's about understanding how you got here." Understanding. That word lingered in my mind long after the session ended. I wanted to understand her, to see the person she'd become, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. It was a wall I couldn't seem to climb. One night, as we sat together in the living room, she broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what things used to be like? Before everything fell apart?" "All the time," I admitted, my voice heavy with regret. "But I don't know if we can ever get back to that." She nodded slowly, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. I want us to build something new, something stronger. But I can't do it alone." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to believe her, to believe that we could rebuild. But there was still a part of me that held on to the pain, that refused to let go of the anger. "I don't know if I can give you that," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." She nodded, her face a mixture of understanding and heartbreak. "I'll wait." Her patience infuriated me. It felt unfair, like she was asking me to do all the work of healing while she stood on the sidelines, waiting for forgiveness. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. She was trying in her own way, and maybe that was all she could do. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what the therapist had said about rebuilding trust. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about choosing to move forward despite it. But could I make that choice? Could I let go of the hurt and try to build something new? I didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time, I realized that maybe I didn't need them all at once. Maybe healing wasn't a single decision, but a series of small steps. And maybe, just maybe, we were starting to take those steps. The first small step came unexpectedly. It was a Friday night. I'd come home from work later than usual, tired and irritable. I walked into the kitchen, expecting the usual silence, but instead, I found her cooking dinner. It wasn't elaborate, just pasta and a salad. But the sight of her at the stove, humming softly to herself, caught me off guard. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice was hesitant, as though she was bracing herself for rejection. I nodded, dropping my bag by the door. "Yeah, thanks." We sat down to eat together, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound between us. It wasn't much, but it felt like the closest thing to normal we'd had in months. Halfway through the meal, she broke the silence. "I know things are still hard, but I just wanted to say thank you for staying, for giving this a chance." Her words caught me off guard, and I put my fork down, staring at her. "I'm not doing it for you," I said, the honesty surprising even me. "I'm doing it because I need to know if there's anything left to save." She nodded, her expression serious. "That's all I can ask." Her humility frustrated me, but it also softened something inside me. She wasn't defending herself anymore, wasn't trying to shift the blame. She was just there, present, willing to take whatever scraps of forgiveness I might offer. After dinner, we sat on the couch, each of us nursing a glass of wine. The silence between us felt less oppressive, more like a quiet truce. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself look at her, not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the person I'd built a life with. The person who, for better or worse, still felt like home. "I've been thinking about trust," I said, finally breaking the quiet. "How it takes years to build, but only seconds to destroy. And how, once it's gone, it feels impossible to get back." She looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "I know, and I don't expect you to trust me again overnight. But I'm willing to do the work, whatever it takes." "Words aren't enough," I said, my voice firm. "If we're going to try to rebuild this, I need actions. I need to see that you're serious about fixing this." She nodded, her hands gripping her wine glass tightly. "What do you need from me? Tell me, and I'll do it." The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. What did I need? An apology wasn't enough. Promises fell hollow. What I needed was something tangible, something real. "I need you to be honest with me," I said finally. "About everything. No more secrets, no more lies. Even if it's hard, even if it hurts." Her face crumpled, and she nodded. "Okay, I promise. And I need time," I continued. "I can't rush this. I need to figure out if I can forgive you, and that's not going to happen overnight." "I understand," she said softly. "Take all the time you need." Her words felt genuine, but they also filled me with a deep sense of unease. What if time wasn't enough? What if trust was something we could never rebuild, no matter how hard we tried? That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what it meant to truly forgive someone. It wasn't just about letting go of the anger. It was about choosing to believe in the possibility of change. But belief felt like a risk, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take it. Still, as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that something had shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the faintest glimmer of hope. And for the first time in months, that felt like a step in the right direction. The glimmer of hope, faint as it was, became a thread I held on to in the days that followed. Therapy sessions continued, bringing both clarity and pain. Each time we peeled back another layer of our broken relationship, I found myself faced with questions I wasn't ready to answer. But one day, during a particularly raw session, the therapist turned to me with a question I couldn't avoid. "What does forgiveness mean to you?" I froze. The room felt too small, too quiet. My wife sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't look at me, and I was glad. I didn't want her to see the uncertainty on my face. "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess it means letting go of the anger. The hurt. Do you think you can let go?" The therapist asked gently. I wanted to say yes, to believe that I could take that leap of faith, and rebuild what had been shattered. But the truth felt heavier than that. I don't know, I admitted. Every time I think about forgiving her, it feels like I'm saying what she did was okay. And it wasn't. The therapist nodded, her expression calm. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of it. It's about deciding what you want your future to look like, with or without this relationship. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about what my future might look like. If I walked away, would I feel relief? Freedom? Or would I feel regret for not trying harder? If I stayed, could I ever truly trust her again? Could I ever look at her without seeing the betrayal? The question circled in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. A few days later, we had another breakthrough, though I wasn't sure if it was progress or just more pain. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, the tension between us palpable. She'd been quieter than usual, and I could tell she was building up to something. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, her voice trembling. My chest tightened, fear gripping me. "What?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling in her lap. "I've been thinking about why I did what I did, and I realize now that it wasn't just about me feeling lost. It was about control, about wanting to feel like I had power over something, anything, when everything else felt like it was falling apart." Her honesty stunned me. It was the first time she'd articulated the why in a way that made sense. And it hurt. It hurt because I realized just how broken she'd been and how little I'd understood. "I wish you'd told me," I said softly. "I wish you'd trusted me enough to share that with me instead of turning to someone else." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that I didn't. But I want to be better. For you, for us, for myself. I just hope you'll give me the chance." Her words broke something in me. The anger I'd been clinging to, the walls I'd built around my heart, began to crack. I didn't know if I could forgive her yet, but for the first time, I felt like maybe I wanted to try. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment or decision. It was a process, a choice I'd have to make over and over again, every day. And if I chose to stay, I'd have to commit to that choice, not just for her, but for myself. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the weight of her betrayal lingered. But as I reached for her hand in the dark, for the first time in months, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. Reaching for her hand that night felt monumental. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a signal, a small step that said I was willing to try. She squeezed my hand back, her grip trembling, and for the first time in months, I felt her relax beside me. The days that followed were tentative. We moved carefully around each other, like two people trying to rebuild a house on shaky ground. The cracks were still there, glaring and deep, but for the first time, we were both acknowledging them. And that felt like progress. Therapy continued to be a mix of catharsis and exhaustion. One session focused on how we communicated or didn't. The therapist pointed out how our avoidance of difficult conversations had created a vacuum, one that allowed resentment and insecurity to grow unchecked. "When did you stop feeling like a team?" the therapist asked. My wife hesitated, her eyes darting toward me before dropping to the floor. It wasn't one moment. It was gradual, little things that built up over time, and instead of talking about them, I buried them. I thought I was protecting us by keeping it all inside. "And what about you?" the therapist asked, turning to me. "When did you feel that shift?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I guess when she started pulling away. I didn't know why, and I didn't want to push her, so I just waited. I thought if I gave her space, she'd come back on her own." The therapist nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like both of you were trying to protect each other, but in doing so, you created distance instead of connection. That's something we can work on." That night, we talked, really talked. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it felt real. She told me about how long she'd felt invisible, not because of anything I'd done, but because of how she saw herself. She talked about how she'd spiraled, how the affair wasn't about love or even desire, but about trying to feel something, anything, that wasn't numbness. Her honesty gutted me, but it also opened my eyes to the depth of her pain. And as much as it hurt, it also made me realize that her betrayal wasn't about me. It wasn't a reflection of my worth or our relationship. It was a reflection of her brokenness, of a brokenness she was finally confronting. In the weeks that followed, we found a fragile rhythm. Small acts of kindness, shared meals, quiet conversations, lingering touches became our way of reaching for each other. There were still moments of tension, moments when the weight of her betrayal resurfaced and threatened to pull me under. But there were also moments of hope, glimpses of the life we were trying to rebuild. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me with a hesitant smile. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers with hers. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we're starting to figure out what okay might look like. And maybe that's enough for now." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for not giving up on me, on us." I didn't say anything, but I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we were on. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were on the right path. Months passed. The rawness of her confession and the immediate aftermath faded into something quieter, something less sharp but still present. The wound was still there, but it didn't bleed the way it used to. Therapy became less about uncovering the damage and more about figuring out how to rebuild. Slowly, cautiously, we began to find pieces of ourselves we thought we'd lost. There were setbacks, of course. Days when I'd wake up and the memory of her betrayal would hit me like a wave, drowning out any progress we'd made. Moments when her touch felt like a lie, and I'd pull away without meaning to. And yet, there were also moments of light. Moments when her laugh reminded me of the woman I fell in love with, or when her vulnerability made me see the person she was trying to become. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, she handed me a notebook. It was small, the kind you'd find in the clearance section of a bookstore. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's this?" I asked. "It's something I've been working on," she said, her voice hesitant. "Our therapist said I should write things down, things I want to say to you, but can't always find the words for. So I started writing letters. To you. About everything." I hesitated, staring at the notebook in my hands. "You want me to read this?" She nodded. "Only if you want to. There's no pressure." I opened it, the pages filled with her neat, careful handwriting. The first letter was dated the day after her confession. It started simply, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I love you. I know I don't deserve your love right now, but I need you to know that it's still true." I read one letter, then another, each one peeling back another layer of her heart. She wrote about her guilt, her shame, her fear of losing me. She wrote about memories of us. Our first date, our wedding day, the night we stayed up until dawn talking about everything and nothing. And she wrote about the future she hoped for, a future where we could find our way back to each other. When I looked up, she was watching me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do you think?" she asked softly. I paused, struggling to find the words. "I think it's honest, and I think it's brave." She smiled, a small, fragile thing, but it felt real. "Thank you." That night, as I lay in bed beside her, I thought about the letters and what they represented. They weren't just apologies, they were promises. Promises to do better, to be better, to fight for us. And as much as I wanted to hold on to the hurt, I realized that maybe it was time to start letting go. The next morning, I made my own small gesture. As we sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee in the quiet of the early hours, I reached across and took her hand. She looked up, startled, and I saw the glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm not there yet," I said, "but I'm trying." Her grip on my hand tightened, and she nodded. "That's all I can ask." It wasn't a grand declaration, and it wasn't a promise of forever. But it was a choice to keep trying, to keep fighting, to keep choosing each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. For now.